Hello and welcome from Mexico City to this episode of Crossing Borders with Nathan Lustig, where I have conversations with entrepreneurs doing business across borders and the people who support them, with a focus on those with some connection to Latin America. This episode is brought to you by LatamList.com. If you like this podcast, you'll enjoy LATAM List's daily tech news reporting. Sign up for the weekly mailing list to get updates. My guest today is Susana García Robles, Chief Investment Officer at IDB Lab, a part of the Interamerican Development Bank based in Washington, D.C. She's also the co-founder of WeXchange, a platform to connect Latin American and Caribbean female entrepreneurs to mentors and investors around the world. Susana has been working in Latin America investment since the late 90s and has been an LP in dozens of funds across the region to help build the ecosystem into what it is today. We cover Susana's first experience with VC in the region, starting in Brazil, and then replicating similar successful programs across the rest of Latin America, and her advice to potential LPs on what to look for in successful fund managers, especially first-time fund managers. We also cover lessons she's learned about what to look for in founders, why and how she founded WeXchange, and why women entrepreneurs are important for Latin America's growth. Susana has some of the most extensive experience investing in Latin America venture capital funds, and it was a pleasure to hear her story. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Susana García Robles. Hey, Susana, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being willing to do it.
Great. Yes, I am willing to do it.
So where in the world are you today?
Well, just for a chance, I'm in Washington, D.C., where I live.
So you say just for a chance. Do you travel a lot?
I do. I usually, when somebody asks me, where do you live? I say, first on a plane, second at the IDB office, and third at my house in Arlington, Virginia.
Yeah, my answer is usually premium economy and Airbnb. So I think So tell me a little bit about what you're doing at the IDB.
Well, I've been doing this in different ways and forms since 1999, but currently I'm in the exciting process of finishing a year of very good projects in which we have invested. As you know, we function as a fund of funds. So we are reviewing investments in venture capital funds. We are analyzing direct equities into startups and scale-ups, loans, venture debt, and some grants for enabling innovation ecosystems in exciting places like Bolivia and Paraguay or the Caribbean. So it's been a really good year with a lot of interesting projects.
For people listening from Latin America, I'm sure they know what the IDB or the BID does, but people in the US maybe don't. So what is the IDB and what do you do?
Okay, the IDB Lab is an innovation lab for the IDB Group. What is the IDB Group? We are one of those multilateral development banks that with the funding from a lot of countries, we help the development of a targeted region. In the case of the World Bank, the region is the whole world. In the case of the Interamerican Development Bank, which is the mother association, is Latin America and the Caribbean. So we have countries that are beneficiaries of this money, every country in Latin America and the Caribbean with a few exceptions of some islands. And then we have donor countries like the US or Japan that give of their overseas development budget into our region. So it's very important that we count with those monies that usually are much more than the monies of the beneficiary countries to do these cool projects. And then the IDB as a bank, as a development bank, does a lot of lending, especially in infrastructure and education and health, working with the public sector. We work more with the private sector, but we can work with the public sector when needed. For example, for an ecosystem program, many times it's very good to have the government support in jumpstarting an ecosystem in a given country.
So you talked about jumpstarting an ecosystem, and you've been involved in venture capital, jumpstarting the Latin American venture capital ecosystem all the way back from 1999. What are some of the most impressive stats that you have to show for your work? You've been investing for probably the longest of almost anybody in the region.
Well, as far as jumpstarting an ecosystem, I think a flagship program is one I did in Brazil with the government, with the innovation agency FINEP, financiadora de estudios y proyectos. And what we did, it was 1999, and for a year and a half, we worked on the design of this project that was going to take care of everything. We were super ambitious. So we wanted to take care of the entrepreneur. We wanted to take care of the investors. We wanted to take care of the regulations and the government, of the startups, and their matching with angel investors. And there was hardly anything going on. So we started this comprehensive approach, and we gathered 4 partners. It was FINEP, it was the MIF, today IDB Lab, and then a pension fund that I don't know how crazily they joined the initiative, even though for a long time they were just like observers, and SEBRAE, which is an organization, public-private, in Brazil that does take care of a lot of programs for small and medium-sized companies. So the first was training the internal team of INEP, changing their minds from being government people to being really entrepreneurs themselves, experts on venture capital, doing a lot of things that they hadn't done before. So we paid for them going to Silicon Valley, to Europe, to different countries, to understanding the ABCs of an ecosystem that works. And then, since they were all Brazilians, to really adapt it to what was happening in Brazil then. And in Brazil then, we were just emerging from the dot-com bubble and burst. So in Latin America, most of the countries were experiencing like a down on these issues. Nobody knew how to pick up themselves and get going. And some governments began to think, well, venture capital is for elitist people, so we don't want this. Brazil was an exception, and that's why the Innovar program was born there. The program ran for 10 years with our assistants. We had several parts of it with them. In the end, we only put $2 million. FINEP put $10 million, and we gave more than $1 billion to companies through the creation of venture capital funds and through direct investments. And our target was the most super risky target that you can ever think. It was first-time fund managers. So we created a funds incubator. We will do a call for proposals for venture capital funds in Brazil twice a year. We will be 3 days closed in a room, smoking at the time, no longer a smoker, and listening to one person after the other one, and then we would vote. Our commitment was not to invest in them for sure. It wasn't a given. Our commitment was, we will tell you as investors what are your good points, your weak points, and all the things that we didn't get because you didn't explain them well. And then the vote will be, we are going to go or not to a due diligence. So in that way, we created at least 35 new local firms, that many of them are still going at it today. So that's one example of a project that I feel very fortunate to have been part of it. And then we replicated that in our project in Peru, in Colombia, in Jamaica. And we did other things. We have been doing a lot of interesting projects, always taking advantage that the IDB Lab is privileged because it has all possible instruments to support an idea, from grants to a contingency recovery grant, to a loan, to equity, direct equity, equity into a venture capital fund. So the grants allow us to help fix some of the problems that we as investors in venture capital funds were seeing. For example, the lack of understanding from the entrepreneur side on what it was to receive a third-party investor. From the investor point of view, the lack of appetite for supporting innovation or understanding how to do a due diligence well, or from the government and regulator side. They didn't know what venture capital was, so all the first regulations in every country in Latin America talk about mutual funds as if they were venture capital, and then they begin to have 500 amendments when they begin to understand the industry. So with the grants, we were fixing those issues, and as a consequence of that, our investments had the possibility to offer a better return. And then How did we know we really had the beat and the sense of what needed to be fixed or helped? Through our investments. Because, oh boy, when I would go as an observer to an investment committee and I would hear for the fifth time in a fund, well, remember when we proposed this investment and we were going to make hundreds of millions of dollars? Well, these are the problems that now we are having. So the return is going to be minus 200%. So I will take note of what was happening. Was it on the entrepreneur side? Was the fund manager who wasn't really giving smart capital? What was happening there? And those inform our grants.
So you're probably the most often, or you've invested the most often as an LP into Latin American VC funds. What are some of the biggest lessons you've learned for how to pick a fund, and what advice would you give to other people who are looking to potentially invest in Latin America VC?
Well, the first advice would be, if you pick a region that is an emerging region, you stay no matter what happens. You don't become a trader. You don't second guess the market. You don't say, oh, this year is looking bad, I'm not going to make an investment. You stay through the good and the bad times, and in the end, your return will be better. We did that. There was, with the exception of 1 year that was justified for other reasons, every year we were doing venture capital investments. No matter what the forecast was, no matter what everybody around me telling me, I would be like, no, we are going to do with prudence, but we are going to keep going on this. So that would be, as an investor, my advice. Then how do you pick the best team? Well, for many, many years, we were trying to really build and create a venture capital industry. So we were betting on first-time fund managers' teams. Nobody was betting on them, or hardly anyone. If they came along with us, was because they believed in us more than they believed in the team, and they believed that together with the IDB Lab, they would learn how to discern who was a good team. So after several years, when we were obtaining results, the bad ones, the neutral ones, and the good results, I did a proxy of what it was a good team, a first-time fund managers team. And I came up with a proxy that told me that the majority of these teams had lived abroad, whether they had studied or worked abroad, but they have had an experience in the US, in Europe, in Asia, in more developed places where venture capital was and entrepreneurship were much more a common knowledge. Then they decided that instead of making it big in a foreign country, they were going to go back to their countries. And they were going to try, almost with a sense of mission or vocation, they were going to try to make it happen in their country. So the first thing they did was to look for friends and colleagues, whether work or from college, that had had a similar experience, and that come by on that idea of, okay, let's make it happen. So it became something that they were initiating for life. They weren't looking for a job. They were not looking to making easy money. They were looking to recreate themselves and give something to their countries as way of, in the way of innovation. So also, because of where they had studied or worked and they had been successful in that, they had very strong connections. So when they were beginning to think about either a fund or when they had the fund established, they began looking into the investments. They would ask their outside network to say, oh, what do you think of this business model? We are thinking of investing in this company. And the professor, because usually a professor in the US or in Europe has had an experience being an angel investor or with venture capital or is familiar with the ABCs of investment, they would get this answer, oh, let me connect you with this other student of mine that 2 years ago did something similar, so he can help you. And all of a sudden their networks were expanded. And why was this issue of network so important for the success of the first-time fund manager? Because a network allows you first to do a better fundraising, then to do a better sourcing of your pipeline, and eventually to have better exits. So networking is really the most powerful currency you can have. If you get from an investor just money, you're not going to get as far as if you get from an investor a smart capital. All that set of networking that it will give you strategies, it will give you ideas, it will set you off on the right trends and connections. And so also the team was complementary to the strategy they wanted to implement. They were not coming with a green fund because green is cool and is trendy. No, something in their history, even if they were very young, made a connection why they thought they could do very good investments in green projects. And last but not least, because it's very tough to be a first-time fund manager, they had made enough money in whatever they had done before that they know, and they had their eyes wide open, that they were about to endure, in the best of cases, 18 months, in the regular cases, 24 months of fundraising, in which officially they couldn't be full-time working and they are older, old jobs, and they had to leave. So, and many of them were married or had young kids. So they had to have a very realistic view of what it means to raise a fund. And they had to have that pockets of money to get them through the fundraising. And the last understanding they had, many of them, and this wasn't ex ante, but they were able to take it while it happened, is that many times a first fund does give returns to the investors, but you don't get to your return. But if you gave returns to your investors, you're almost guaranteed that you're going to have a second fund. And that's why that vision of creating something for life is more important than the ones that were trying to think in a very naive way, oh yeah, venture capital, in a minute or two, I will be a billionaire. And more or less, even though, exceptions are always a confirmation of the rule, they were all in a bracket between 30 to 40 years old. That bracket in which they began itching and thinking, I don't want to be an employee of somebody else. I want to create my own outfit. So in the end, they were as entrepreneurial as the entrepreneurs they were trying to support.
What advice would you give to Latin American family offices that are looking at VC? Because we see kind of two paths when we've gone out fundraising. One is there's families that maybe will pick 3 to 5 VC funds and put small checks and test them out, and then maybe put in bigger checks later. And then we've seen some that have picked one fund and written a big check. Do you have an opinion on which is the better path forward for them to learn about VC and potentially make more money?
Sure. I think it's better for a family office to test 3 to 5 venture capital funds with the smaller checks, not very small. Please, you guys have a lot of money. Just let it go out of the checkbook instead of just one fund. Why? Because one fund is like, what are the chances that you had such a good eye that will be the fund that will give you a lot of returns? In many ways, family offices look many times for the triple P return, the profits, the people, and planet. So if you put all your eggs in one basket, many times you just get an omelette, crash eggs, but not really the money. 3 to 5 venture capital funds, with the commitment that maybe in 2 years, when they are raising the following fund, or in 3 years, they will put a bigger allocation into the ones that perform the best. I think it's a better strategy. The strategy I don't think is good, and you didn't mention it, but I've seen it a lot, is when family offices think they can do a better job by investing directly and not investing in venture capital funds. I would say in general, you can be as close as the companies as if you had invested directly, but also building an industry, supporting a consolidation of the industry, and also that our own fund managers, the fund managers of the region where the family office is located or wants to support, become more relevant globally. So I don't like it when I see a lot of family offices telling the fund managers, no, I will not put money into your fund. I will accompany you in a direct investment. So you can invite me when you're investing to co-invest with you. I think the best strategy is that they invest in venture capital funds, test it, and begin to put greater allocations.
And there seems to be a bigger trend from the US, Asia, and Europe looking at Latin America, why should people outside of the Latin American region be interested in supporting either Latin America tech or Latin America VC?
I don't think when somebody from the US or Asia or Europe look at Latin America, they do it as with my vision from the IDB Lab. They are investors. They want to go where the opportunities are and they want return. So I totally respect that. I want all that plus the effect in the region. So I'm more ambitious than them. But what I think is attracting people to Latin America is that Latin America as a region is today at an inflection point. We have finally, after years of trying to stop and goes in this industry, etc., we are coming up with our own brand of how to do it in Latin America, which is not trying to make the Silicon Valley in Brazil, Argentina, Chile, or whatever. It's not to do a startup nation in Mexico. No, it's our own brand. And what is this brand? Well, the brand is that an entrepreneur walks the streets of his or her city. And what do they see? They see many times, they see that if people drink their water, they are going to be sick. And they see poverty around them. They see lack of recycling and cleanliness in the streets. They see that they want to get a small loan and the banks don't even look at them. They see people that don't get to be educated because they live in rural communities. They see people that don't get the appropriate health care because they also live in rural communities. And so they have this entrepreneurial blood running through their veins. They are very accustomed to technology and living in a technology-flooded world, as we all are. And they come up with ventures that have a clear social and environmental awareness, plus the fact that they want to make a model to address a challenge that is real. Being a challenge real means that it can be scaled up to many other places where it's happening. So that is attractive to an investor. It's not that everything coming out of Latin America is super disruptive. It's that we know our problems and we are finally addressing them with the right tools. Innovation for inclusion, technology that makes us reach farther than ever before, technology that makes the solutions cheaper, technology that allows us to go from a region like Latin America and the Caribbean to transported to the problems that maybe Africa has or one country in Africa. So for an investor, that's what is attractive, that they wouldn't know how to do it. They haven't experienced that pain. And without pain, there is no gain. And the entrepreneurs of today are experiencing those pains, whether they are experiencing in their own lives or the fact that their countries or cities are being known by being countries or cities with a lot of problems. They want to change that. And even though I don't like stereotypes, if you think that most of the entrepreneurs are within the bracket of millennials, that by the way are growing up, they are no longer the millennials that seem so young to us, they do have that conscience. They want to fix the world. So this is an incredible moment for Latin America because they know the pain their people are having and they know they have the tools to fix it.
Switching gears to the entrepreneur side, you've seen lots of successful and not successful startups get investment when you've been on investment committees of funds that you've supported. What have been some of the biggest lessons learned from seeing the investments in the successful companies, but then also the ones that everyone thought was going to be successful and then didn't work?
Well, I'm going to start with a few examples of what didn't work. And it usually goes back to the team because venture capital and investments is not about numbers, it's about people. So in my previous life, I studied philosophy. And when I came to this side of my life, investment, some people were like, you what? You have a master's in philosophy and education? And what are you doing investments? And I used to say, I use it a lot, believe me. It's the most useful tool I have because you are dealing with people. So the biggest mistakes in the companies were that the fund manager focused a lot on the business model that could be successful or not, as we know, and didn't understand that the team was not cohesive, that there were internal wars between the co-founders, or that one co-founder had a vision of growth and the other one didn't accompany him or her in that dream. Or that one, and I'm thinking of a very painful example because that company could have been the precursor of Uber at the time, but one of the co-founders was the total diva. His aim in life was to show up at every interview or press conference that he could do while the company was going to pot. And then he was blocking the decisions of the other founder that got the idea of how to grow this company. So for a long time, the fund manager, his effort was on trying to get rid of this diva guy, give him, a role in the board of the company, but very passive, so he could work with the other entrepreneur. So that took years. By the time they really got the company going, Uber was beginning to happen. And today it's a company that, when they exit, it will exit at, 1.2x with a lot of luck. And it could have been something incredible. The other thing, and by default, I'm talking about what works, right? The other thing is when an entrepreneur falls in love with the solution he or she created instead of falling in love with the problem. So it's unable to pivot. When they realize this is not working, they get stuck in that instead of moving forward. And this is very linked to our own culture. In Latin America and the Caribbean, we are taught that if something doesn't come out right, that is a failure, and you become a failure yourself. In Spanish, a fracasado. So nobody wants to be walking with the F on your forehead saying, I'm a failure, right? So we tend to put all that under the rug and show this image to the world that everything is going fine. So that doesn't help for venture capital. That doesn't help on your entrepreneurial journey. So what made a big dent in this very bad culture is the beginning of the accelerators programs, because by default, I don't think they intended to do it, but it was something so radical at some point that by default, they taught entrepreneurs that pivoting was okay, that failing and having to merge this team that was creating this company that was going to be bad with this other team that was creating a company that more or less was going to work, the value was in them, not in the company. So they merged teams, they came up with good companies, and that, began to create like those waves of thinking, okay, so if at first I don't succeed, I keep trying. And that is very important for Latin America. So the best companies also have been the ones who have stayed focused. And this applies also to fund managers. If you are all over the planet, sooner or later, this is going to be bad. Why? Because you can't be everywhere and anywhere. And in a company, if you have like 5 or 10 verticals of action, in the end, you'll have 5 clients in each vertical and you're not going to grow. So again, the best entrepreneur, and I'm thinking of a Brazilian company several years ago, are the ones who all of a sudden realize, well, okay, we have started very aggressively with all these verticals, and in the end, we are always going to be like this, growing but not really consolidating. So from one day to the other, they erased 5 verticals, and they said, and by the end of the year, we'll know the 3 that will be focused on, and that company was a success.
One of the other very cool things that you've done in the region is WeXchange. Can you tell me what it is and why it's important?
I usually say that when I die, I want in my tombstone some projects I have made. So WeXchange will be there number 1. Before WeXchange, it was going to be in Novar, Brazil, but sorry, Brazil, I think WeXchange is regional. WeXchange happened when we at the IDB began looking at our operations with a gender lens, and we realized that at the IDB Lab, as investors in venture capital funds, we had very few companies that were co-founded by a woman. And, we began thinking, why is this? And we came up with the theory, why? And then we took with this other person who today is an entrepreneur in Berlin, but at the time she was working here. She and I spent like 6 months checking with the wisdom of the crowd talking to people in Europe, in Silicon Valley, in New York, in Texas, in Latin America, why they thought there were so few women in the industry. And the ones who were in the industry were not getting a lot of traction. And so the theories all were the same. So knowing the place where I work, I said, well, if we really want to make something big, we should have not the theory of Susana and Monica, but something much more with the bigger name. So we went to Ernst & Young, that was just moving to EY at the time, and we told them, we want you to do a report interviewing a lot of entrepreneurs from Latin America and the Caribbean, understanding their challenges, their opportunities vis-a-vis their male peers, and come up with a profile of who are these high-impact entrepreneurs in Latin America and what are the obstacles they face, etc. So that was a report that we launched in 2013, and the time we call it We Grow. Today we are about to have another update on that report. We will no longer call it We Grow. We'll come up with WeX Insights, a much more aligned name for our report. So WeXchange is a platform of encounter for all entrepreneurs in Latin America, women entrepreneurs that are venturing out of STEM. In the beginning, it was more for women with technology companies, but then we realized that the STEM is such a taboo in our region that we said, no, we have to be even more aggressive on this. So we changed it, and 3-4 years ago, the focus was women STEMpreneurs. And we had to do a lot of explaining what it was to venture out of STEM careers. In Latin America, people were saying, oh, well, so maybe I have a fintech, maybe this is not for me. And I would be, hello, yes, the T of technology. But we wrote, we featured people that with a degree in engineering had done a traceability company for, cattle ranches in Uruguay. We did a lot of showcasing because the concept of STEM is a concept that in Latin America still is much more associated. If you did one of these careers, in the end, either you work in the countryside or you work in a lab and you're a researcher, and it's much more comfortable. But guess what? WeXchange as a platform of encounter allow us to find many more entrepreneurs. So that's very important. Then it came networking. Of course, we want women to network with men and women. WeXchange is not an event only for women. So we invited investors, we invited mentors, we invited governments that were having cool programs to support entrepreneurs. We created sessions on mentoring and then sessions on training according to what we saw they needed, because their needs are a bit different depending on the stage they are. Once they begin to grow, the needs of a woman entrepreneur and a man entrepreneur are the same. But in the beginning, women tend to be juggling many more things than men, or at least in their minds, they are much more in charge of things and family responsibilities than men.
If you could go back to when you were first starting to invest in VC funds in Latin America, knowing everything you know today, what advice would you give yourself?
That's a very good question. The advice I would give myself 20 years ago is I would have been even more aggressive. I would have tried to fight more for more money every year for more funds. In the beginning, as you can imagine, I wasn't able to have that kind of weight in the decisions. I stood my ground when I was told, don't do it this year, the region is not doing well, and I would be like, no, either we do it always or we don't do it. But one thing I can do is to have tested more venture capital funds, but also to have pool of the ones not doing well sooner. I think there is always a hesitation when things are not going well. How long do I stay until I declare that this is not going to be good? And I think now we feel much better, and we know what caveats to put, so we can pull the plug and everybody can reinvent themselves. We as investors going to better teams, and the fund managers maybe doing something else if that is what they shouldn't be doing. So that would be one advice. The other one would be I started understanding quite soon, early on, that I needed to really be out there in the public, telling the story. I didn't write from the very beginning as much as I do now. So I think I would write and put all the knowledge that every year I was acquiring, and at some point put it all together, maybe every 2 years, more often, instead of, I remember 2010, like the year I thought, oh my God, if I'm all the time on a plane, if the plane goes down, my team, instead of putting roses on my tomb, are going to be looking at my coffin and saying, why didn't you tell us more? So 2010 for me was a very important year. I began to do things with writing, lessons learned. I engaged with Professor Josh Lerner. We wrote about how to start the venture capital industry in Latin America. It was a year in which, I don't know, I didn't have any feeling my plane was going to go down, but I had that visual idea of I owe it to the team and to the region to begin to put together so many years of learning things. So I would have done that way earlier in my career.
What books, blogs, podcasts, documentaries do you like to recommend to people, whether about entrepreneurship or just life in general?
Oh, well, of course, Crossing Borders. That's my night table book. Okay, no, I did read it for all the people who are listening to me. I read a lot of the books that other fund managers are writing. So that's why I don't want to tell you the titles because I'm advertising for them. But what I do tell you is that some years ago, I went to, I think it was the Global Entrepreneurship Summit, and I heard Jeff Hoffman on the notion and the concept of info-sponging. Do you know what it is? Okay, so info-sponging is, and he was recommending, that when you are 24/7 in an industry, you really have to read unrelated articles that will spur your innovation. And he said that really Priceline was born out of him reading how the cargoes of bananas many times get rotten waiting for them to be sold. So he read that, didn't make any connection. And then one day he's traveling and he thought, I wonder how many seats are empty here. So these airlines are really losing money because they didn't sell all their seats and therefore Priceline. So I'm the daughter of a historian. That everybody who knows me knows this, that it has defined myself in many ways. So I love reading history books. I love reading about art, and I love reading about Egypt. When I was a kid, I told my mother I wanted to be an anthropologist, so an archaeologist. And I began to try to read what the sarcophagus said on the covers. And my mother, seeing my obsession, told me, how about if you think about a profession or a career that is a little bit more practical? So I went back to her and said, okay, I'm going to study philosophy. By that time, my mother gave up and said, okay, just do whatever you want, study philosophy. So she was very happy when I decided that having studied philosophy and education, I was now going to go to the dark side of the investment world. And she said, oh, you finally listened to your mother. I said, yes. So my books are very eclectic, very different. All of a sudden, I get totally focused on learning Italian. So I begin to read in Italian, even though I understand half of it, but I want to make it happen. So I would say go for info-sponging. Get outside what you're accustomed to read and try to get your innovative side of the brain kicking in.
Besides for learning Italian, what's next for you and for IDB?
Well, I think IDB and IDB Lab especially is on a path of growth, of trying to not only be known by the financing we give, but by the connections we build, the bridges we build among regions, and also the knowledge from our projects that in the end it can be one of the best gifts to the public and private sectors. If we tell them what we learn, the good, the bad, and the ugly, we empower the region, the entrepreneurs, investors, the governments, the ecosystem. So I think we are on a clear path of doing that on the IDB. Personally, I think maybe from Latin America to the world, I don't know, more next. you should interview me in 7 months. You'll see what has happened. I can't tell more now.
I was going to say, we could talk for hours about this. You have so many lessons to share, and hopefully we can get more out just in case that plane goes down, knock on wood that it won't. And we'll do an update in 9 months or so, and be able to see what you've done over the last bit, and also share some more stories. So thanks again for being willing to do it.
Great.
Really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of Crossing Borders with my guest, Susana García Robles, Chief Investment Officer at the IDB Lab and founder of WeXchange. If you like the podcast, please share it with a friend and give us a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks to Angel, Sofia, and Josefina for helping produce this podcast and writing the show notes, and thanks to you for listening. Have a great rest of your day.